Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. If this is your first time here, you might wonder what it is. Let me tell you. The Humanities Forum happens most Fridays throughout the semester in this very room. And it's an initiative of the Humanities program through which we bring together the Providence College community, the campus, to hear from scholars and journalists from around the world, to encounter new ideas and fresh perspectives, and to deepen our appreciation for the humanities. And you might just think a phrase like "from around the world" is just polite boilerplate. But as you'll find out today, we really mean it when we say guests from around the world. Dr. Keating will introduce our guest in a second, though, so I won't say more than that. But what I will say is what you should expect is first we'll hear from our guest lecturer. Then there will be a chance for questions and answers. And if you've been here before, you know that you, student, have to ask the first question. And make sure that the other microphone gets to you so that your words can be captured in all their glory on YouTube for generations to come. We'll wrap up the Q&A around 4:45, at which point there's a reception right next door in the Fiandella Great Room, and we hope you'll join us there to continue socializing and all that stuff there. So, the only other thing I need to remind you, and it looks like some of you know this by now, because I see very few laptops out, is if you have a laptop out, you close that shimmering screen right down so you can give your full attention to what proceeds in this room. All right, with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Jim Keating, who will introduce our guest today.
Thanks. The Humanities Forum, we have, I don't know, how many do we have a year? 12 a semester. We have some endowed lectures, and this is one of the endowed lectures. Donors who we've worked with who like what we're doing and will support it. This is the Aquinas Lecture. And for the Aquinas Lecture, our goal is to find a leading scholar in Catholicism. And this year we've been very lucky to find and to have Dr. Tracey Rowland, who does come from around, I guess exactly around the world, I don't even know how that works, but Australia, that's far enough. Dr. Roland is a leading Catholic theologian and a sharp commentator on the place of Catholic theology in today's world, often looked at in a historical perspective. She holds the St. John Paul II Chair of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, not the one in South Bend, but in Australia. She was a member of the 9th International Theological Commission and was awarded the prestigious Ratzinger Prize in Theology, which is rare and a high honor. Think of it like a Nobel Prize in theology. That's what it is. She earned her doctorate in philosophy from Cambridge University and her licentiate in sacred theology from the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome. She is the author of several books. The first of hers, and maybe it's the first, I don't know, but it's the first that I read, is Culture in the Thomistic Tradition, which caused quite a stir because the Thomists thought it was critical of them, but it wasn't. But it, in some ways, at least put her on the map as far as American audience was concerned. Other books include Ratzinger's Faith, the Theology of Pope Benedict XVI, Catholic Theology, which is an extremely handy and well-done survey of the field, and most recently, which I did not know about, but it sounds absolutely fascinating, Beyond Kant and Nietzsche, the Munich Defense of Christian Humanism, 2021. And with that, I offer you Dr. Tracey Rowland.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keating. Yes, Culture in the Thomist Tradition was the first book, and it was certainly not intended to be critical of the Thomist tradition. So what happened in the church and the world in 1968? This paper will be divided into two sections. The first will offer a panoramic snapshot of the events of that year, since most of you are so young that you'll have no historical memory of those times. And the second will focus on how these events were mere epiphenomena of underlying seismic movements in the fields of philosophy and theology. Juan Aranzadi, a Spanish follower of the Chinese Marxist leader Mao Zedong, said of 1968 that its principal characteristic was a kind of spectacle that embodied all the goals of the French Revolution until then. He also described it as a surrealist utopia, which not only he lived, but his entire generation. Historians now refer to the generation of 1968 as the first global generation, meaning that across the world, members of this generation tended to have a similar intellectual orientation. The French sociologists have coined the expression the 68ards to refer to its members. 1968 was a year of cultural revolutions across the world. And like the French Revolution, the revolutions were in most of their orientations anti-Christian, especially anti-Catholic, hostile to any form of hierarchical social order and decision-making, and libertine in matters of sexual morality. So how did this surrealist utopia unfold? Well, on the 15th of January, the campus of the Catholic University of Leuven, located in a Flemish-speaking part of Belgium, erupted in student protests. The Kingdom of Belgium is famous for its combination of different ethnicities, principally the French-speaking Walloons and the Dutch-speaking Flems. The competition between the two groups has at times been intense. In 1968, the leaders of the Catholic University of Leuven announced that classes would continue to be offered in French in addition to the Flemish language. This was notwithstanding the fact that the Francophone Walloons were a minority group on the campus. This decision led to rolling protest events across Flanders, which brought down the Belgian government. The crisis was only resolved by splitting the university into two institutions, one French-speaking and one Flemish-speaking, located 21 miles apart. If you ever go to Belgium and you want to go to that university, make sure you know which one of the two you want to go to, because people famously end up at the wrong one. Such student protest movements were to become a significant element in the surrealist utopia. March 1968 began with the Battle of Valle Giulia in Rome. It took the form of violent clashes between some 4,000 students and the Italian police. The students, influenced by Marxist social theories, protested against what they called the bourgeois value system and managed to destroy some 9 police cars. A week later, protests broke out in Poland after students were expelled from the University of Warsaw for criticizing Soviet-style Marxism. While students in Italy were embracing Marxism, some 5,000 students in Warsaw and others in Krakow, Poznan, Lublin and Wrocław were protesting against Marxism, or at least the version of it that had been imposed upon their country by the Soviet leaders. A month later, here in the United States, Columbia University students protested against the Vietnam War. They took over administration buildings and effectively shut down the University of Columbia for 6 days, the amount of time it took for the New York Police Department to take control of the situation. However, by far the most dramatic of the student protest movements began on March 22. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who became known as Danny the Red, led 150 students to occupy the administration building of the University of Nanterre. They had a number of demands, but the highest on their list was the right to sleep together on university property. This protest led to the temporary closure of the university, and this act set off further protests at other institutions. including the Sorbonne, France's oldest and most prestigious university. On May 6, 20,000 student protesters marched towards the Sorbonne and clashed with the police. And then they set up barricades to seal the streets around the Sorbonne and to keep the police from entering. Catholic priests who were chaplains to various student groups sided with the students and handed out communion to the protesters. Joseph Ratzinger was later to remark that this was for him the most disturbing single event of 1968. The idea that Catholic priests would go about handing out communion to students demanding the right to engage in casual sex. On May 11, police stormed the barricades around the Sorbonne, and on May 13, a one-day general strike was called, with labour groups walking off their jobs to show respect for the students. By May 21, 8 million French workers were on strike, and the stock market was closed, and Orly International Airport had to be closed. On May 24, President Charles de Gaulle publicly pleaded for an end to the strike and announced a national election, which his party won with a large majority. You can imagine that. What begins as a student protest in one provincial university demanding the right to be able to sleep together on university property ends up with a national strike with 8 million French workers just supporting the students, and the stock market closing, the major international airport closing, and the President of France having to call a national election. Notwithstanding the re-election of Charles de Gaulle, May 68 is now associated with the moment when one of the great institutions of Western civilization, namely the university, began to be seen less as an institution concerned with the pursuit of truth and more a place where one practices the art of student activism for social change. While all the great universities of Europe were founded either by Christian monarchs or Catholic bishops, after 1968, many universities around the world, not merely in Europe, turned into incubators for varieties of anti-Christian ideologies. Universities changed from merely offering a social sanctuary to skeptics and atheists to being the primary agencies of criticism of Western culture and Christianity in particular. In Marxist philosophy, the concept cultural hegemony refers to the beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and moral norms of a ruling class, whose worldview is accepted as the cultural norm. According to the student radicals of 1968, the ruling classes of Western societies had for centuries promoted Christianity as their, quote, dominant ideology. Thus, in order to destroy the social leaders, it followed that one had to undermine the cultural force of Christianity itself. Different Marxist factions had different ideas about how to go about this. The Italian communist Antonio Gramsci drew a distinction between what he called a war of maneuver and a war of position. The war of maneuver was the Stalinist model. One simply used political violence to achieve one's ends. Gramsci thought this would not work in the more highly developed Western countries. For these, he recommended a war of position. In a war of position, one first identifies switch points of social power and then seeks to peacefully take control of those switch points. The important positions are school principal, university professor, government policy maker, education department bureaucrat, and journalist. In 1967, Rudi Dutschke, a West German student leader, reformulated Antonio Gramsci's philosophy of cultural hegemony with the phrase, the long march through the institutions. instead of a long military march, such as the one undertaken by the Marxist Chinese leader Mao Zedong, in the highly developed Western countries, the long march would be through the most culturally significant of our social universities, through our schools, through our most socially significant social institutions, that is, through our schools, our universities, courts, parliaments, and the media. While students in Western Europe were protesting about matters like the right to sleep together on university property, students in the United States were protesting about the war in Vietnam and about civil rights for Black Americans. The war in Vietnam began in the mid-1950s and ended in 1975. On one side were the anti-communist forces of South Vietnam. These were supported by some 2.7 million American troops, 320,000 South Korean troops, 61,000 Australian troops, 10,000 troops from the Philippines, 3,800 from New Zealand, and some 30,000 Canadian volunteers. The North Vietnamese communists had the support of 3,000 troops, 2,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 5,000 anti-aircraft guns, 200 surface-to-air missile batteries, and daily financial aid of some $2 million from the Soviet Union. In the United States and in Australia, tens of thousands of students took to the streets to protest against being drafted to serve in this war. The United States military conscripted approximately 1.9 million service personnel into their ranks over the course of the Vietnam War, while the Australian government conscripted some 15,300 Australians to serve. While opposition to the service in the war did not in most cases stem from an intellectual attraction to Marxism, the leaders of the protest drew upon Marxist theories of a military-industrial complex to explain the causes of the war and thus to provide a narrative explaining why government leaders supported it. The counter-narrative of military leaders in the United States and in Australia was that if Vietnam fell to communist leaders, this would encourage a domino effect, with one country after another in Southeast Asia coming under the dominance of communist leaders. This would have negative consequences for the US presence in the Pacific region and for the security of places like Australia that lie at the bottom of Southeast Asia when looking at the globe from the perspective of the Northern Hemisphere. Thus, while students may have begun to protest against being conscripted into what was a civil war in another country for reasons of not wanting to die in someone else's war, their involvement in the protests drew them into the orbit of student leaders for whom Marxist social theory was their preferred intellectual framework. When it comes to the civil rights movement, there were some groups, like the Black Panther Party, that was Marxist-inspired. However, the more mainstream leaders of the civil rights movement, like Dr. Martin Luther King, were inspired by Christian principles, recognizing that all human beings, regardless of genetic characteristics, are creatures made in the image and likeness of God. The civil rights movement was largely based on Christian principles, not Marxist, and was thus an exception to the general orientation of the protest movements of 1968. Notwithstanding this fact, 1968 was not what one would call a Christian moment. When it comes to religious traditions, the generation of '68 were attracted more to Eastern than Western forms of religion. All things Eastern were in and all things Western were out. Modes of dress relating to both India, the country, and indigenous North American Indians became fashionable. love beads, or multiple strings of multicolored beads worn by both men and women, have an origin in Hindu and also Native American cultures. The love bead fashion had begun at least a year earlier during the so-called Summer of Love, when some 100,000 young people converged on the suburb of Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco wearing hippie-style clothing. Their slogan was, "Turn on, tune in, and drop out." A similar but smaller movement arose in London. On April 27, 1968, the UK's Abortion Act of 1967 came into effect, legalising abortion on a number of grounds, with the abortions covered by the National Health Service. One might summarise these elements of the surrealist utopia with the statement that the sexual revolution was a significant component of the cultural upheaval of 1968. In her book, Autobiography of a Generation, Louisa Passerini wrote, "The idea was to destroy, abolish the connection between sexuality and love, to reject the family, and to violate fidelity." That's one of the historians of the generation of 68. In the United States, 68 was also a presidential election year. On June 5, after thanking supporters for his win in the Californian primary, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. And his assassination followed that of Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4. On August 20, the Soviet government led a Warsaw Pact invasion of what was then called Czechoslovakia. In opposition to the so-called Prague Spring, a movement within the ruling Czech and Slovak Communist Party to allow citizens greater freedom of travel and a few economic reforms, the Soviet government deployed some 500,000 troops, 6,300 tanks, and 550 combat aircraft to bring the country of Czechoslovakia back into the Soviet-controlled orbit. Amidst all of this political violence and social turmoil and experimentation with Eastern forms of religion, music, food and dress, the Catholic Church was the only institution with any hope of offering an alternative voice and social vision. So now let us turn to what was happening in Catholic circles in 1968. The Second Vatican Council had ended in December of 65. In 1966, the Dutch bishops issued what became known as the Dutch Catechism. It was translated into many languages and became an international bestseller. However, it was widely regarded as doctrinally unsound to such a degree that Pope Paul VI set up a commission of cardinals to make a report on the document. The cardinals' report included some 50 pages of criticism, which was then published by the Dutch bishops as an appendix to their catechism. Of greater significance, however, was Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, released on July 29, 1968, which upheld the Church's centuries-long teaching against the practice of contraception. One of the encyclical's opponents, the German theologian Bernhard Häring, wrote that no papal teaching document has ever caused such an earthquake in the Church as the encyclical Humanae Vitae. He may well have been correct about this fact. Cardinal Francis Stafford, who supported the document, described 1968 as the year of spiritual trial. The magnitude of the seismic pressures placed on the papacy and the priesthood after the July 29 release of the encyclical is evident in the following memoir of Cardinal Stafford. He said, "The summer of 1968 is a record of God's hottest hour. The memories are not forgotten, they are painful. They remain vivid like a tornado on the plains of Colorado. They inhabit the whirlwind where God's wrath dwells. In 1968, something terrible happened in the church. Within the ministerial priesthood, ruptures developed everywhere among friends which have never healed, and the wounds continue to affect the whole church. The dissent, together with the leaders' manipulation of the anger fermented, became a supreme test. It changed fundamental relationships within the church. It was a spiritual trial for many. That's all a quotation from Cardinal James Stafford. Opposition to Humane Vitae fostered a widespread culture of dissent. If magisterial teaching could be rejected or read down or declared to be a mere moral ideal, then the teaching authority of the magisterium was in crisis. The possibility for the Church to offer an alternative vision of the meaning of human sexuality to the generation of 1968 was lost. It was not for another decade, with the election of Karol Wojtyła in 1978, that an alternative vision was finally offered in the form of John Paul II's Catechesis on Human Love, which I understand in the United States is marketed as his Theology of the Body. Another decision of Pope Paul VI that was almost as explosive as Humane Vitae was the promulgation of the new rite of the Mass in April '69. Against a barrage of complaints, Paul VI was on the defensive when he spoke of the demise of Latin in the new Missal in his general audience address of November 26, 1969. He said, "No longer Latin, but the spoken language will be the principal language of the Mass. The introduction of the vernacular will certainly be a great sacrifice for those who know the beauty, the power, and the expressive sacrality of Latin. We are parting with the speech of Christian centuries. We are becoming like profane intruders in the literary preserve of sacred utterance. We will lose a great part of that stupendous and incomparable artistic and spiritual thing, the Gregorian chant. We have reason indeed for regret, reason almost for bewilderment. What can we put in the place of the language of the angels? We are giving up something of priceless worth, but why? What is more precious than those loftiest of our church's values? The answer will seem banal, even prosaic, yet it is a good answer because it is human, because it is apostolic. He said, understanding of prayer is worth more than the silken garments in which it is royally dressed. Participation by the people is worth more, particularly participation by modern people, so fond of plain language, which is easily understood and converted into everyday speech. Reading these words, one can only conclude that Paul VI was making a sociological judgment that more people would take part in the Mass if it were offered in the vernacular. The issues raised in this speech continue, however, to be debated some 50 years later. Moreover, the scholarship in the field of linguistic philosophy would suggest that it is never easy to convert a hieratic language into the language of everyday speech. This point was made by the late Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, who in his doctoral dissertation examined the issues in linguistic philosophy on this point. He wrote, "Cultural forms and linguistic expressions are, in fact, not distinguished from the thoughts and message they carry, as accidents are distinguished from substance in classical philosophy. A change in form inevitably entails also a change in content. A change in words changes in some fashion the way we think." One work which helps to explain the Church's own role in the Cultural Revolution of 1968 is The Spirit of Vatican II, subtitled Western European Progressive Catholicism in the Long 60s by Geert Rayner Horn. This work helps to explain how some of the strongest Catholic communities in the world, for example, the Dutch Church of the 1950s, could within a decade become penetrated by Marxist ideology. In the first chapter, Horn examines elements of Catholic theology in the 1960s, which led lay and clerical leaders to see elements of the surrealist utopia as something positive. First, there are the liberal readings of the document Gaudium et Spes, or what might be called the Skilobexian reading, rather than the Voitilian reading. This includes the Signs of the Times theme. The liberal reading of Christ's exhortation to his apostles to read the signs of the times is that the Holy Spirit speaks through social movements. The way that Joseph Ratzinger interpreted the same exhortation is to say that Christ was making an eschatological point. He was telling his apostles that they must understand that he, Christ, was the sign of their time. According to Ratzinger, Christ was not telling his apostles that the Holy Spirit makes his intentions known through the claims of the leaders of social protest movements. The second of Horn's chapters is titled Red Priests in Working Class Blue. It examines the influence of the worker priest movement in France, Belgium, Holland, and Switzerland. Horn draws attention to the activities of radical priest associations that sprung out of the experience of the worker priest movement. He makes the point that the priests who had been members of this movement were often radicalized to such a degree that they found it easy to embrace Marxism. The fourth chapter, however, is perhaps the most sociologically interesting, insofar as it examines the strongly Christian backgrounds of the leading student radicals of the mid to late 1960s. As Horn moves from country to country, citing the names of the national student leaders, their biographies reveal, one after another, that not only did they have strong Christian formations, but in many cases they were actually former seminarians. Horn's macro-level thesis is that a utopian messianic dimension of Catholicism overlapped with the secular ideals of the generation of the 1960s. Messianic Catholicism and Marxism captured the imagination of a generation, and these twin forces reinforced one another. Another sociological analysis is offered by Julie Pay-Geese. In her research on the social backgrounds of the student protest leaders, she notes that as many as 40% of those interviewed reported having experienced a primary religious socialization. One of the key concepts used in her research was the distinction between mass religiosity, understood in a Weberian sense as the need for ritual and institutionally dispensed supernatural aid, or what in Catholic theological parlance is called a strong participation in the sacramental life of the Church, and what she calls the religiosity of the virtuous, which is less about sacramentality and more about ethics. Those whose formation fell into the type of the religiosity of the virtuous were the most easily politicized. They had been brought up in Catholic families to think that Christianity was about being a good person. This is what Joseph Ratzinger called Christianity as a form of moralism. He was critical of this in the encyclical Deus Caritas Est. The reduction of Christianity to the status of a moral framework was fostered by Immanuel Kant's project of separating theology from philosophy and then defending Christian moral teachings with reference to reason alone, that is, without any reference to Scripture. Of course, Christianity does have a moral code, but Ratzinger's point is that it's not just another moral code on the smorgasbord of moral codes, that Christianity is primarily about a relationship with the Holy Trinity. Peggy's research showed that those who had been brought up in Catholic families where this was understood, that is, where it was understood that the primary thing about Christianity is your relationship with the Trinity, people from those families were much less likely to become leaders of Marxist student groups when they went to university. But if they'd come from a Catholic family, where being a Catholic was presented as following some specific moral code, when they went to university in the late 60s, they wanted to keep a moral code, but they didn't particularly want the Catholic moral code because they didn't want to have to go along with things like no premarital sexual intimacy, so they dropped the Catholic moral code and adopted the Marxist. A third academic work of value in the context of analysing the Church's own contribution to the social phenomena of 1968 is Mark Masser's Catholics and American Culture, subtitled Fulton Sheen, Dorothy Day and the Notre Dame Football Team. In particular, Chapter 8 of this work provides an account of the history of the Congregation of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, a Californian order of nuns that in 1968 boasted some 560 religious women renowned for the academic excellence of the schools they administered. At their flagship school, Immaculate Heart College, in Los Angeles, the art department was run by someone called Sister Carita Kent. Masser writes, Carita was known nationwide for her whimsical and often provocative artwork. Creative pastiches of biblical quotes, boldly juxtaposed colours and commercial images. In 1964, she had transformed Immaculate Heart College's annual religious festival, hitherto known as Mary Day, into what was arguably the first college-based hippie happening in the United States, grabbing national headlines with black-robed nuns parading in flowered necklaces, poets declaiming from raised platforms all over the campus, and painted students parading in the grass. Mary's Day became a prototype for the hippies' 1967 Be-In San Francisco. Carita left her congregation in 1968. In 1971, she designed the Boston Gas Company's gas storage tank, and in 1985, she designed the US Postal Service's 22-cent love stamp, which was launched on the set of the comedy show The Love Boat. Cardinal Francis McIntyre, the Archbishop of Los Angeles, went on television describing Carita's art as blasphemous and warning parents to be careful about what their daughters were taught at that school. Today, Immaculate Heart High is famous as the alma mater of the activist Meghan Markle. And if any of you have followed Meghan's statements in the press, you will know that her intellectual framework is a long way away from what we might identify as a Catholic intellectual framework. Masser's macro-level point is that in California, at least, the epicenter of the hippie movement, it was a congregation of female religious infected with some peculiar interpretations of the documents of the Second Vatican Council on the renewal of religious life, which anticipated elements of the hippie culture. How are we going for time? Okay, good. A further factor in the Church's failure to offer an alternative to the surrealist utopian visions of the generation of '68 is the influence of Frankfurt School social theory, commonly called critical theory, upon Catholic theology. Pope John the 23rd's buzzword aggiornamento, meaning renewal, coupled with the reading of the Signs of the Times mantra, fostered the idea that Catholic theology needed to engage with the fashionable philosophies and social theories of the era. And the most fashionable was the Frankfurt School's critical theory. In his article Theology and Praxis, published in 1973, Charles Davis, one of the big British Catholic names of the 1960s, pointed to the significance of this appropriation with the rhetorical question: is theology the critical self-consciousness of Christian praxis? Or does theology begin with the belief that the truth has already been given to us, and its intellectual effort consists not of attrition against reality, but of assimilation of something which is already in its entirety? In other words, is the Catholic faith something we receive as a gift through divine revelation, or is it something we have to construct for ourselves through contemplating contemporary social theories and their embodiment within our society? The idea that theology should be the critical self-consciousness of Christian praxis undergirds the work of those Catholic scholars and ecclesial leaders who reject scripture and tradition as the foundation stones for Catholic belief and seek to replace them with their own judgments based upon social theories. For some of these theologians who have been heavily influenced by the cultural Marxism of the Frankfurt School, an intense anti-intellectualism drives their projects. Some even go so far as to argue that the Holy Spirit chooses to speak through the uneducated, that is, people who have not been corrupted by a bourgeois education. Typically, these are people who themselves received a bourgeois education, though this irony does not seem to enter into their critical consciousness. For example, it is an historical fact that all the big-name proponents of liberation theology in Latin America were educated at elite European universities, mostly in Belgium and Germany, where they encountered Marxism and later brought it back to Latin America as a souvenir of their studies in Europe. To return to the observation of Jan Aranzadi about the surrealist utopian vision of the Soixante-Huitards, one can say that there was a generation in rebellion against an imperfect world. It was also, for the most part, in rebellion against Christianity. I say for the most part because, of course, the civil rights movement in the United States was being fostered in many cases by Christianity. Almost 20 centuries of Christianity had failed to deliver the perfect society, so this generation sought an explanation and a way forward, an alternative way. The French revolutionary recipe of liberty, equality, and fraternity was more appealing than the Christian idea of socially embodied truth, goodness, and beauty. The French revolutionary recipe requires a change in social structures, while the Christian idea requires a change within the person. The Christian worldview also includes the concepts original sin and grace, for which there is no analogue in Marxism or in liberalism. Without these concepts, it is difficult to explain why social perfection is an impossible project to achieve, and how a wounded human nature can be healed. The surrealist element in the utopian vision of the Soixante-Huitards is related to this naivety. They believed that original sin could be denied and social problems could be resolved by bureaucratic means, by a change in political structures, policies, and procedures. They also underestimated the complexity of the nature of freedom and the problems which would arise if truth were to be replaced by political correctness. So for the Marxist, there is no objective truth. Our conceptions of truth are all related to our position within the social structure. And so we, in effect, create our own truths. The Soixante-Huitards were also utopian in their belief that social differences, and even the differences between the sexes, could be eradicated. Their success in separating love from sexuality and then separating sexuality from reproduction has not diminished the numbers of those seeking counselling for all manner of sexual experience-related problems. Mandatory sex education programs and freely available contraceptives have done nothing to lower the rates of abortion. Half a century after the year of spiritual trial, to quote Cardinal Stafford, new generations are beginning to opt out of the social experiments of this generation. A new generation of Catholics are reconnecting love and sexuality, reconnecting moral theology with sacramentality, rediscovering the beauty of solemn liturgy, and above all, they are understanding of the principle that truth is a divine gift, not something we construct for ourselves. Thank you.
Got about 20 minutes for some questions. That wasn't a question, that was a statement. 20 minutes for questions.
Thank you for coming today. That was an awesome talk. I appreciated it. You said in 1966 the Dutch Catechism was deemed doctrinally unsound. Can you expand on that, please?
I haven't actually read it myself, but there are a whole lot of what we would regard as basic Catholic ideas which were made look ambivalent at the very least in that catechism. Things like the virgin birth, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. There was a whole list of basic principles which were very unclear. So what Paul VI did was he first of all organised this commission of cardinals to go through the whole document and to say this is problematic, this is problematic. And the response of the Dutch bishops was to continue to publish that document, but to include this 50 pages of critique as an appendix. Further, Paul VI issued his own document, which was known as the Credo of the People of God. And in it, he reaffirms the Catholic teaching about the virgin birth, belief in the real presence of Christ, and a number of other things that had been kind of brought into question by the Dutch Catechism. So Paul VI's response was really the Credo of the People of God, which I understand the French philosopher Jacques Maritain assisted in the formulation of that document. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to preface this with this thought is kind of half-baked. So towards the end, you talk about the idea of, like, I guess, utopia or, like, utopian kind of thoughts, I guess, coming from the more Marxist side. And maybe you implied that that's not really congruent with Christian thinking, that, like, that big change can come through, or maybe not change, but, like, really positive structure can come through political structure. I didn't know if maybe you could just expand on that a little bit, or maybe clarify or just explain.
Marxists believe that, well, what they want is some kind of, perfect society where, in the words of Karl Marx, you can hunt in the morning, fish after lunch, and read newspapers in the evening. It's as if they want to eliminate all the difficulties in life and think that it's possible to do that as we become more scientifically developed. So science becomes a kind of analogue for grace. So if you can imagine, if you can think about the Marxist tradition as being a kind of eschatology, it's actually said by many commentators that Marxism is a secular eschatology. So it tries to eliminate what it sees to be injustice. It tries to eliminate all kinds of social problems. But in every country in the world where it's been implemented, it has dramatically increased the social problems, totally destroyed people's freedoms, and been responsible for murder, on a very large scale. I can't remember the statistic, but the number of people killed in Marxist countries in the 20th century, I think, is some number over 70 million. So it always ends up causing a loss of freedom and forms of oppression. And it does so because of this belief that if you just get the right policy, if you just get the right economic theory and you impose it on people, you will achieve this great end, But it never works. And Christianity, in contrast, says there is such a thing as original sin. We are all born basically good. So the Catholic intellectual tradition insists that even after the fall, humanity is still basically good, but wounded. Some of the Protestant groups will say after the fall, it's worse than wounded. But the Catholic tradition says still basically good, but wounded. And there's nothing that any political leader can do to eradicate original sin. The Catholic solution to the problem of original sin is to try and encourage people to grow in the likeness of Christ. And we have the sacraments to assist us to do that. And the sacraments are sources of grace for the human person to heal the spiritual imperfections. Very few people end up, great saints. Some do, Some do become great saints, but many of us don't. But at least we can continue to have the ideal and continue to strive for that ideal and to use the sacramental life of the church as an aid to improving. That, I would say, generates a whole lot more social freedom than the attempt to bring about a utopia through political means. So, if you think about it analogically, are we going to improve social life through primarily political means or through primarily sacramental means? Now, that doesn't mean that the Catholic Church is not at all interested in changing the way some institutions operate, because there are better ways of operating. But it is to say that we don't put all of our hope in politics and bureaucracy.
Dr. Roland, thank you for coming all the way from Australia to Providence College. I am actually reading your book, Beyond Kant and Nietzsche, and I'd like you to maybe elaborate a little bit about this idea of Christian humanism, particularly because these the Christian humanists you write about in Munich were trying to wrestle with how could someone like Hitler take over our society, and the danger of the preparation for how we are susceptible to that new kind of messianism of destiny. And I think there are parallels in our world today that I'd like to hear what you think.
Yes. I really enjoyed writing the Beyond Kant book. It was what I did when I was locked down in Australia. I come from the city which was locked down longer than any other city in the entire world. So I wrote that book. And what I discovered was that between the two world wars in Germany, there was a whole generation of scholars, of Catholic scholars, most of them based around Munich, who understood that we were living through a time when Christianity was being criticised from the perspective of people who thought that we had simply failed to deliver. 2,000 years of Christianity, and what do we have? World War I, when Catholic British soldiers are shooting at Catholic Bavarian soldiers in the trenches of the Somme, or Protestant Prussians are shooting Protestant Brits in the trenches of the Somme. It just makes no sense, So these people understood that really people like Friedrich Nietzsche and some of the more contemporary early 20th century social theorists who had abandoned Christianity really were making some valid criticisms of Christianity as it was currently operating in Europe. And they took those criticisms seriously, and they tried to explain that Christianity is itself a form of humanism and a form that is superior to, say, the Nietzschean option, which is today one of the most powerful alternatives to Christianity. So I'm not sure if that is helpful. You mentioned destiny, and one of the ideas that came through one of these authors was the author was Theodore Haker. He's famous for being a translator of John Henry Newman and a translator of Soren Kierkegaard into German. He said that the Germans, or at least some of them, have never really lost their pagan attachment to the concept of destiny. So when Christianity spreads throughout Europe, pagan tribe after pagan tribe gets converted to Christianity. But there is a theory that some of the tribes in the north, the tribes that were a long way away from Rome, retained some of their paganism even after conversion to Christianity, and that in the German national mythology, this belief in the destiny of the German tribes and the concept of fate remains strong in this sort of German culture, especially in the Prussian German culture. And you see that if you read Wagner or if you read Nietzsche, there is this strong sense of fate being an element in public life, and some people being fated to be great, or some nations being fated to be great, and others not. And that notion of fate is not a Christian concept. We don't believe in fate. we believe that we have free will. And so there's, again, if you look at the analogues, there's a contrast between belief in free will, belief that we actually are in control of our own destiny, that we're not governed by what astrological sign we were born under, or, we're not governed by something in the stars, which is this pagan concept. So I think today, as people become less influenced by Christian intellectual ideas, they are becoming more fatalistic, and they are more likely to start believing in things like astrological signs and the idea that, there is something out there in the universe that is controlling their lives, but it's not the Christian God.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. Earlier you mentioned that people who grew up in families who emphasized the personal connection with the Trinity were less likely to be influenced by Marxist ideas. And I agree with that, it makes a lot of sense, but how do you think those families acted differently than the other families? What did they do right specifically? And then how do you think the church and society as a whole can use that information and try and make changes?
I think the point was that if the family was one which presented the Catholic faith as a system of rules and regulations for moral conduct, if you can imagine these people arriving at university in the late 1960s, the contraceptive pill has just become freely available. Okay, so there's no contraceptive pill before the 1960s. So the generation of 68 are the first generation in human history who have anything as effective by way of contraceptives as the hormonal pill. So they get to university and they find themselves, asking the question, well, if I can take the contraceptive pill and not get pregnant, why can't I sleep with my boyfriend? So in order to continue to support the church's teaching, you need a sacramental understanding of sexuality. And if you don't have that, all you've got is really this practical idea of, well, premarital sexual intimacy is dangerous because I might become pregnant. Take away the danger, what's the problem? And so many of them started to feel as though the Catholic moral teaching no longer made any sense. And I think it's quite fair to say that before the 1960s, often Catholic moral teachings in this area were not taught very well. And there was also the problem of Jansenism, which was a heresy, and Jansenism has a really negative attitude toward anything that is sensual, whether it's sensual music or just any kind of beauty, or even a morally valid expression of human sexuality within the context of marriage. So a typical Jansenist would think that if you were a good and holy person, you would enter religious life, and if you were just ordinary and couldn't deal with celibacy, then you got married. That's a sort of Jansenist attitude. So I would say that the church was not particularly good at teaching sexual ethics in the 50s. And so this generation arrives at uni. The church's teaching on sexual ethics doesn't make much sense to them anymore, but they still have this orientation to be good people. And the Marxists there are saying, look, there are all these different minority groups who need to be liberated from their condition of being a minority group. And if you want to be a good person, you'll dedicate your life to that. And so they kind of morphed into being part of these Marxist protest movements, whereas those who came from the families where it was much more about having a real personal relationship with the Trinity, for those types, I think, it was easier for them to understand the link between, say, sexuality, love, and the sacrament of marriage. I don't know, does that help? Yeah?
Hi, oh, sorry, I'm very loud. Thank you for being here, Dr. Rowland. My question is, in light of, you talked a lot about Vatican II, and I'm curious that to what credit you give Vatican II to much of the revolution of 1968, and particularly the end of the 60s into the 70s. In other words, had Vatican II not convened or existed, do you think that we would have seen the same movement, progress, political upheaval that we saw, and at the time that we did see it, or do you think something that was going to naturally?
I think, I'm not sure whether it was Joseph Ratzinger. No, I don't think it was Ratzinger. Somebody said that it would have been good for Vatican II to have occurred either at the end of World War I or in 1989, after the fall of Marxism in 1989. But it occurred in the 60s, and so there was like a perfect storm of factors. The documents of the Second Vatican Council were written in a way that was meant to be, the word is irenic, peaceful, not aggressive, not abrasive. The fathers of the Second Vatican Council hoped that non-Catholics would read these documents and would be persuaded by them. But one of the downsides of this very diplomatic language is that some things became ambivalent. And then in the late 1960s, a number of the Dutch and Belgian theologians become very enthusiastic about critical theory. And even Karl Rahner, who in some circles is regarded as a liberal, Karl Rahner said that in the 60s and 70s there was a certain amount of what he called gnosiological concupiscence. By that he meant that Catholic scholars were running around picking up social theories as intellectual partners for theology without much discernment. So the metaphor is like the pickup metaphor. You've got people going around and not being too choosy about what theories they try to partner with Catholicism, and in places like Belgium and Holland, you do have this situation arising where you have a very intensely liberal interpretation of the Vatican II documents. And then we have the pontificate of John Paul II with the intellectual partnership of Joseph Ratzinger, where the two of them try to say, look, the documents are fine, but you have to read them with what they called a Christocentric accent. And if you don't read them with that Christocentric accent, you can end up in a completely different place. So, look, I think it's hard to know what would have happened. But because Vatican II occurred in the 60s, when this revolution occurs, the Church is in a position where she is being very introspective, very focused on her own internal issues, and she doesn't have a unified theoretical framework with which to counter this enthusiasm for Marxist social theory. So it's hard to know. I certainly think that there were many good things that came out of the Second Vatican Council, and that there are ways of interpreting the documents of the Second Vatican Council that are not are not causing a rupture with the previous intellectual tradition. Okay, so Pope Benedict talked about Vatican II being about reform, not about rupture. And that's the position I take.
Thank you so much, Professor, for coming and delivering your lecture. I have a question about what the church has to do now. If in '68 the generation of sexually liberated Marxist liberals won the day for the next 50 years, ushering in an era of a post-truth era.
Yeah.
But you kind of indicated in your lecture that perhaps this was on the way out.
Yeah.
With a new generation that seems to hunger for something more substantial. Mm. So, in our age, what would you say are the main questions of the church? Mm-hmm. What does she have to answer?
Well, I think the number one, the absolute highest on my list would be the defense of truth. I think that's the number one thing she has to do right now, and it's kind of paradoxical because in the 18th century the church was accused of being obscurantist and against reason, and now it's the Catholic intellectuals who are the people on the stage of the world with Jordan Peterson defending truth. It's sort of down to us to defend a belief in objective truth. I think that's the most important thing. But along with that, I think there is this notion of a Christian humanism, and it's grounded, of course, on our relationship with the Trinity, but a part of that is this notion of there being objective truth, objective goodness, and objective beauty. And I think we have to defend all three, and all three are under attack. I think the sexual revolution attacked goodness, but the contemporary postmodern attack is directed towards truth. And Hans Urs von Balthasar argued, I think very effectively, that in a Catholic culture or a Christian institution, truth, beauty, and goodness need to work in tandem. And if you only have one or two, the system's weak. You need all three. And Balthasar believed that of the three, the one people find easier to get, or the one people have less opposition to, is beauty. And that's why people like your Bishop Robert Barron are so interested in beauty, because they're trying to present the faith in a way that is attractive to people who've already given up on truth and goodness. I'm not sure if that helps. There's a new journal out called New Ressourcement. It's just had one edition. It's being published by Word on Fire Academic Press, and I have an article in that on what I think is sort of the way forward theologically, but highest on the list is we've got to defend truth.
Let's give a warm round of applause to Professor Roland. Please join us next door. Thank you.